"You're just a child playing dress-up in my world," Marcello sneered, his shadow looming over her. Sophia adjusted the silk collar of the dress he bought her, leaning in close. "And you're just a criminal who's one phone call to my mother away from a life sentence. Don't forget who keeps your hands clean, Marcello." The heat of Milan in July was not merely a matter of temperature. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of expensive exhaust, roasted espresso, and the unyielding pressure of expectation. As Sophia Conti stepped off the private jet at Linate Airport, the shimmering tarmac seemed to ripple like a mirage. She smoothed her linen trousers, her fingers tracing the sharp crease, a habit born of years in law lecture halls where precision was the only currency that mattered. She had spent the last 3 years in London, carving out an identity that didn't involve the shadow of the Conti name. But as the black Maserati Levant pulled up to the curb, she felt that shadow stretching out to reclaim her. Inside the car, the air conditioning was a surgical strike against the humidity. Her mother, Luciana Conti, sat in the back seat, her eyes fixed on a tablet. Luciana didn't offer a hug. She provided a schedule. At 55, her mother was the Iron Lady of the Italian legal system, a woman whose firm didn't just defend clients, it rewrote the reality of their actions. "You look tired, Sophia," Luciana said, her voice like velvet draped over gravel. She didn't look up. The flight was only 2 hours. "I hope London hasn't made you soft. We have a busy summer ahead, and I need you focused. The firm is at a critical juncture with the VD accounts." "I'm not soft, Mother. I'm just wondering why my presence is required for clerical observation when I could be interning at The Hague," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the irritation prickling at her skin. Luciana finally looked up, her piercing gray eyes scanning Sophia with clinical detachment. "Because The Hague offers theory. I am offering you the reality of power. In this city, the law is not a set of rules. It is a fence. You need to know where the gates are, and more importantly, you need to know the people who own the keys." The car glided through the city, passing the high-fashion boutiques of the Quadrilatero della Moda, where the windows displayed mannequins draped in thousands of euros worth of silk. They eventually turned into the courtyard of the Conti estate, a sprawling neoclassical villa that felt more like a museum than a home. But today the atmosphere was different. There were men in dark suits standing near the perimeter who didn't belong to the household staff. They were broader, their stances more aggressive, their eyes hidden behind dark lenses despite the shade of the portico. "Who are they?" Sophia asked, nodding toward the men. "Security," Luciana said simply. "Times are changing, Sophia. The boundaries we've maintained for 20 years are being tested by younger, less disciplined elements of the underworld. I've decided that for the duration of the summer, you will not go anywhere without a detail." Sophia scoffed. "A detail? I'm 23, not 12. I don't need a babysitter to go to the library." "You won't have a babysitter," Luciana said as the car doors were opened by a stone-faced driver. "You will have Marcello." The name hit the air as a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. Marcello Vidi. Sophia remembered the name from hushed phone calls and late-night meetings she wasn't supposed to overhear as a child. He was the silent partner, the man whose name never appeared on the Conti firm's letterhead but whose interests occupied 70% of their billable hours. He was the head of the VD syndicate, a man who had survived 3 decades of gang wars and federal investigations, allegedly because Luciana Conti knew exactly which documents to burn and which judges to dine with. They entered the grand foyer, where the scent of lilies was overwhelming. Standing near the marble staircase was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. Marcello Vidi was 50, but he carried himself with the vitality of a man in his prime, tempered by the stillness of a statue. His hair was a sophisticated salt and pepper, slicked back from a face characterized by hard angles and deep-set, obsidian eyes. His suit was bespoke, a charcoal gray that screamed understated wealth, but it couldn't hide the lethal intent that sat just beneath his skin. "Marcello," Luciana greeted him, stepping forward to offer her hand. He didn't kiss it. He gripped it with a familiarity that made Sophia's stomach turn. It was a partnership of equals, or perhaps a pact between monsters. "Luciana," Marcello replied, his voice a deep, melodic baritone. He turned his gaze toward Sophia, and she felt the temperature in the room drop. He didn't look at her with the polite interest of a family friend. He looked at her the way a wolf looks at a fence, calculating the height, looking for the weakness. And this must be the little scholar. "Sophia, you've grown." "I've graduated," Sophia corrected him, refusing to flinch. She stepped into his personal space, defying the instinct to recoil from the faint scent of tobacco and expensive cologne that clung to him. "And I've spent the last 3 years studying the various ways men like you end up in maximum security. It's a pleasure to finally meet the case study in person." A flicker of something, amusement, irritation, passed through Marcello's dark eyes. He took a slow step toward her, forcing her to look up. "Law books are heavy, Sophia, but they don't stop bullets. And they certainly don't stop the men who fire them. Your mother thinks you need a guardian. I think you need an education in how the world actually works when the lights go out." "I don't need either," Sophia snapped, looking at her mother. "This is ridiculous. You're putting me under the protection of a man who is the very reason we need security in the first place." "Marcello is the reason you are safe, Sophia," Luciana said sharply. "He will accompany you to the office and to your social engagements, and he will oversee your movements. This is not a request. It is the mandate for your stay in Milan." Marcello leaned in close, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "I've spent 20 years keeping your mother's hands clean, little girl. I'm not going to let her legacy, or mine, be ruined because you want to play at being independent. For the next 3 months, I am your shadow. Get used to the dark." Sophia felt the trap closing in. She looked from her mother's cold, calculated expression to Marcello's predatory smirk. She was a Conti, and in this house the only way out was to play the game better than the people who invented it. "Fine," Sophia said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that masked a sudden, sharp clarity. "But if you're going to be my shadow, Marcello, try to keep up. I tend to move much faster than men of your vintage are used to." Marcello's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I have 50 years of experience in catching things that try to run, Sophia. You're going to find that I'm very hard to lose." The following evening, the stifling heat of the villa was replaced by the neon-drenched pulse of Brera. Marcello hadn't spoken a word to Sophia since their confrontation in the foyer, but his presence was an inescapable gravity. He sat in the back of the car, his profile illuminated by the passing streetlights, sharp, ancient, and utterly unreadable. When the car stopped, it wasn't at a library or a quiet cafe. It was in front of L'Eclisse, a club whose entrance was a nondescript steel door guarded by 2 men who looked like they were carved from granite. "Why are we here, Marcello?" Sophia asked, her voice tight. "My mother's mandate was protection, not a tour of your watering holes." "Your mother's mandate was an education," Marcello replied, stepping out of the car and not waiting to see if she followed. "Tonight, you learn how the city breathes when the law is asleep." Inside, the club was a cavern of shadows and deep crimson light. The music wasn't the thumping techno of the tourist traps. It was a low, vibrating bass that felt like a heartbeat. Men in silk shirts huddled in velvet booths, their voices low, their eyes constantly moving. As Marcello walked through the room, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just respect. It was a physical retreating, a clearing of the path. He was the apex predator in this ecosystem, and everyone, from the bartenders to the high-ranking capos, knew it. He led her to a private table on a raised mezzanine that overlooked the floor. "Sit," he commanded. "And watch." Sophia sat, her jaw clenched. She felt exposed in her simple black slip dress, her skin prickling under the gaze of a dozen men who looked at her like she was a trophy or a target. What am I watching for? Crime. I'm sure I can find a dozen health code violations just by looking at the ice buckets. Look at the man in the corner, Marcello said, ignoring her sarcasm. He pointed a manicured finger toward a table where a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, was arguing with a girl who couldn't have been more than 18. The man's face was flushed, his movements erratic. That is Enzo. He thinks that because his father owns the docks in Genoa, he can treat my establishment like a playground. He's been told 3 times to leave the girl alone. He hasn't listened. So call the police, Sophia said, though she knew the answer. The police would take 40 minutes to get through the door, and Enzo's father would have the charges dropped by morning, Marcello said. In this room, I am the police. I am the judge. And I am the executioner. He stood up and signaled to the 2 men who had been standing by the mezzanine stairs. Sophia watched, her breath hitching as they descended. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't scream. They simply stepped behind Enzo, lifted him by his elbows, and dragged him toward the back exit. The girl scrambled away, disappearing into the crowd. What are they going to do to him? Sophia asked, her legalistic mind already tallying assault and kidnapping charges. They are going to remind him that his father's money doesn't buy him manners in Milan, Marcello said, sitting back down and taking a slow sip of a dark amber liquid. He'll have a few broken ribs and a very expensive hospital bill. He won't come back. You're a monster, Sophia whispered. You bypass every due process, every human right, just because someone was rude? Marcello leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. The crimson light caught the silver at his temples, making him look like a devil from an old Renaissance painting. That girl is the daughter of one of your mother's junior clerks, Sophia. If I hadn't intervened, Enzo would have taken her to a hotel, and your mother would have spent the next 6 months trying to hush up the scandal and keep the clerk from talking to the press. I didn't just punish a rude man. I protected your mother's interests. I protected you. The realization hit Sophia like a physical blow. She looked down at the crowd, seeing the invisible threads that connected this dark room to the polished marble of her mother's office. Her mother wasn't just defending these people. She was part of the machinery that kept them in power. The professional boundaries weren't a wall. They were a bridge. She knows, Sophia said. It wasn't a question. She knows you do this. She relies on it, Marcello said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Luciana provides the shield of the law. I provide the sword that ensures the shield never has to be used. We are 2 sides of the same coin, Sophia. And whether you like it or not, you are the inheritance that coin is meant to buy. Sophia felt a sudden, sickening wave of claustrophobia. She stood up, her legs trembling. I want to leave. Now. The night is just beginning, Marcello said, his eyes tracking a movement near the door. And you haven't even seen the best part. A man approached the table, a man Sophia recognized from the news. He was a prominent politician, a reformer who had campaigned on cleaning up the city. He shook Marcello's hand with a sickening warmth. They spoke in low tones for a few minutes before the politician slipped a small, heavy envelope into his jacket pocket and walked away. Sophia felt the world tilting. Her education had taught her that the law was a grand, impartial structure. Marcello was showing her that it was a puppet show, and her mother was one of the lead puppeteers. You think you're so much better than me because you have a degree, Marcello said, watching her face. But you're wearing shoes paid for by that envelope. You're living in a house built on those broken ribs. You've been living in the dark your whole life, Sophia. I'm just the one turning on the lights. I hate you, she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and a terrifying newfound awareness. Hate is a very honest emotion, Marcello replied, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. It's much more useful than the polite lies you're used to. Now let's go. I have a dress to buy for you for tomorrow's gala. If you're going to be a Conti, you need to look like you're worth the trouble you cause. As they walked out of the club, the cool night air felt like a lie. Sophia looked at Marcello, his straight back, his absolute confidence, and realized that the man she had been told to fear was the only person in her life who was telling her the truth. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. If you found out your family's wealth was built on these kinds of envelopes, would you walk away or take over the business? Tell us your thoughts below. The morning after the club was a blur of high-tension silence. Marcello did not apologize for the violence Sophia had witnessed, nor did he explain the envelope. Instead, he arrived at her quarters with a garment bag that looked like it cost more than her law school tuition. We are attending the Gala dei Fiori tonight, Marcello announced, leaning against the doorframe of her dressing room. Your mother will be there, as will half the cabinet. You will not look like a student today. Sophia pulled the zipper down, and the fabric spilled out like liquid light. It was a dress of emerald silk, so deep in color it was almost black in the shadows. It was exquisite, but as she held it up, she realized the scandal of it. The back was non-existent, held together by the thinnest of gold chains, and the neckline was a daring plunge that left nothing to the imagination regarding her transition from girlhood to womanhood. This isn't a dress, Marcello. It's a provocation, Sophia said, her voice echoing in the marble room. It's a statement, he countered, his eyes raking over her with a clinical yet heavy intensity. A Conti doesn't hide. A Conti commands the room so that no one dares to look away. Put it on. Sophia wanted to refuse, but she saw the challenge in his gaze, the silent implication that she was too afraid to inhabit the power her mother wielded. She retreated into the dressing room, the silk sliding over her skin like a cool caress. When she stepped out, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Marcello's posture shifted. The casual lean against the doorframe vanished, replaced by a rigid, predatory stillness. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the rug. He stopped just inches away, the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and cold iron, filling her senses. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her bare shoulder before he adjusted one of the gold chains. His touch, even through the leather of his glove, felt like a brand. You look like a woman who knows secrets, he murmured, his voice dropping into that dark melodic register that made her heart hammer against her ribs. That is the most dangerous thing you can be in Milan. Is that why you bought it? Sophia asked, her breath hitching. To make me a target? Or just to see if I'd break under the weight of it? I bought it because I wanted to see if the girl I saw on the balcony, the one with fire in her eyes, was still there, or if she'd been buried under all those dusty law books. He leaned down, his lips ghosting past her ear. Don't disappoint me tonight, Sophia. The people at this gala eat the weak for breakfast. Stay close to me, and they'll be too afraid to bite. I don't need your protection to survive a dinner party, she snapped, though her body betrayed her, leaning ever so slightly toward his warmth. This isn't a dinner party. It's a negotiation, Marcello said, pulling back, his expression once again a mask of professional indifference. And you are the most valuable asset on the table. As they descended the grand staircase of the villa to the waiting car, Sophia felt the shift. She wasn't the little scholar anymore. She was a weapon, draped in emerald silk, being wielded by a man who knew exactly where to strike. She looked at Marcello's profile in the dim light of the Maserati, realizing that the dress wasn't a gift, it was a bribe. He was trying to buy her loyalty, to wrap her in the luxury of his world until she forgot the blood on the floor of the club. But as she caught her reflection in the window, Sophia made a silent vow. She would wear his silk, she would walk by his side, but she would not forget. If she were an asset on the table, she would be the one to flip it. "You're very quiet," Marcello noted, his hand resting near the gear shift, dangerously close to her knee. "I'm just thinking about the professional boundaries my mother mentioned," Sophia replied, her voice cold and sharp. "You're treading very close to them, Marcello. Does she know you like to play dress-up with her daughter?" Marcello's grip on the steering wheel tightened, the leather creaking under his strength. "Your mother knows I do whatever is necessary to ensure the Conti name remains untarnished. If that means making sure you look like royalty instead of a runaway, then that is what I will do. And if I decided to tell her that her shadow has a wandering eye?" Marcello slowed the car to a crawl as they approached the gates of the gala. He turned to her, his obsidian eyes burning with a fire she hadn't seen before. "Then you would be admitting that you've been watching me just as closely as I've been watching you. And we both know what happens when two predators stop stalking and start circling." He stepped out of the car and walked around to open her door, offering his hand. Sophia took it, her fingers disappearing into his palm. The cameras of the paparazzi began to flash, a blinding white sea of light. "Smile, Sophia," he whispered as they stepped onto the red carpet. "The world is watching." "Let them watch," she whispered back, her head held high. "I'm going to give them a show they'll never forget." What would you do if your mother's friend were a 50-year-old mafia boss? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. The Palazzo Real was a labyrinth of mirrors, gold leaf, and the heavy scent of gardenias. It was the kind of room designed to make a person feel small, yet as Sophia walked in on Marcello's arm, she felt amplified. Every head turned. The emerald silk caught the light like a dangerous secret, and the gold chains against her bare back were a defiant glimmer in the face of the conservative Milanese elite. Luciana was already there, positioned in the center of a circle of magistrates and industrial titans. When she saw Sophia and Marcello, her eyes didn't soften, they sharpened. She took in the dress, the proximity of Marcello's hand on Sophia's waist, and the subtle, possessive tilt of his head. "You're late," Luciana said as they approached, her voice cool enough to frost the champagne flutes. "The lady required time to prepare," Marcello said, his voice smooth. "And as you can see, the results were worth the wait." "She looks like she belongs on a billboard in the Navigli, not at a state gala," Luciana retorted, her gaze sweeping over Sophia. "Go and speak with Justice Moretti, Sophia. He was asking about your thesis on corporate liability." It was a dismissal. Luciana was trying to put her back in the box of the little scholar, the dutiful daughter who functioned as a trophy of her mother's successful parenting. Marcello stepped back, his face returning to that impassive professional mask, as if he were nothing more than a bodyguard. Sophia felt the familiar sting of her mother's control, but this time it was sharpened by the memory of the club, the broken ribs, and the envelope. She didn't move toward Moretti. Instead, she took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and stood her ground. "Actually, Mother, Justice Moretti and I have very little to discuss. His recent ruling on the VD shipping injunction was legally sound, though I found it curiously lenient." A silence fell over the immediate circle. Luciana's smile didn't falter, but her knuckles whitened around her glass. Marcello shifted his weight, a subtle movement that Sophia felt rather than saw. "Sophia is just finding her voice after so many years in London," Luciana said to the group, her laugh sounding like breaking glass. "She's forgotten that in Milan, we appreciate discretion as much as intelligence." "Discretion is for people with something to hide," Sophia said, her voice projecting just enough to carry to the nearby tables. She turned her gaze to Marcello, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. Isn't that right, Marcello? Or do you find that your business thrives better in the shadows my mother provides? Marcello stepped forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He placed a hand on the small of her back, right where the silk met her skin, and leaned in. I think the heat is getting to you, Sophia. Perhaps we should take a walk on the terrace. I'm not going anywhere, Sophia said, pulling away just enough to look him in the eye. And don't treat me like a child who's had too much sugar. I'm the only one in this room who knows exactly how the professional boundaries work. Marcello's associates, a group of 3 men who had been standing a few feet away, moved closer. One of them, a man named Russo with a jagged scar across his chin, gave a low chuckle. The kitten has claws, boss. Maybe you've been too soft on her. Marcello's eyes flashed, a sudden violent spark that made Russo's smile vanish. Watch your tongue, Russo. She is a Conti. And I am a Vidi associate, Sophia interrupted, her voice ringing out. She stepped toward Russo, ignoring the way Marcello's hand tightened on her arm. Which means I know that the protection my mother provides your organization is the only thing keeping the Guardia di Finanza from seizing every asset you have from here to Sicily. If you think I'm a kitten, ask yourself why your boss follows my mother's orders like a loyal soldier. The tension in the room became a physical weight. Luciana looked like she was ready to commit murder, and the men around them had gone deathly still. Sophia had broken the cardinal rule of their world. She had spoken the unspoken. Marcello didn't explode. He didn't drag her away. Instead, he stepped into her space, his chest nearly brushing hers, his height looming over her. The babysitter was gone. The protector was gone. In his place was the man who ran the city's underworld with an iron fist. You want to talk about the law, Sophia? He whispered, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Then let's talk about the law of the jungle. You're standing in a room full of lions, thinking your mother's name is a cage that can hold them. It isn't. It's a ribbon. And ribbons can be cut. Then cut it, Sophia challenged, her heart racing, her body humming with a terrifying adrenaline. See what happens to your empire when the Conti firm stops answering your calls. Marcello stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. For a second, she thought he might actually strike her. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a smile, a real one, dark and admiring. You're exactly like her, he murmured, loud enough for only her to hear. Beautiful, brilliant, and absolutely convinced of your own invincibility. It's going to be a pleasure to watch you realize how wrong you are. He turned to the group, his voice projecting a calm authority that smoothed over the cracks she had just made. Forgive the young lady. She has spent too much time with English barristers. She forgets that in Italy, we prefer our fire in the bedroom, not the ballroom. Now, if you'll excuse us, I think it's time Sophia and I had a private discussion about her education. He gripped her arm, not enough to bruise, but enough to leave no room for argument, and led her toward the exit. As they passed Luciana, her mother didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes promised a reckoning that would make Marcello's threats look like a lullaby. Sophia didn't care. As she was led out into the humid Milanese night, she felt a strange, intoxicating sense of freedom. She had reminded the boss who her mother was, but in the process, she had realized something even more important. She wasn't afraid of the boss. She was afraid of how much she liked the way he looked at her when she fought back. Does Marcello's protective side make him more dangerous or more attractive? Vote in the comments. #LethalProtector or #DangerousLiar. The drive away from the Palazzo Real was silent, but it wasn't the cold silence of the previous days. It was a pressurized stillness, like the moment before a storm breaks. Marcello drove with a controlled ferocity, his hands tight on the leather-wrapped steering wheel of the Maserati. He didn't head back toward the villa. Instead, He steered the car toward the heart of the city, weaving through the thinning midnight traffic until the spires of the Duomo rose like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. He killed the engine in a shadowed corner of the piazza, the car's cooling metal ticking in the quiet. Sophia sat staring ahead, her heart still hammering from her defiance at the gala. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold realization of the bridge she had just burned. "You have a very loud mouth for someone who understands how silence works," Marcello said finally, his voice low and scraping against the quiet. He didn't look at her. "I'm tired of the silence," Sophia replied, turning her head to look at his profile. "My mother uses silence as a weapon. You use it as a shield. I want to be the one who talks." Marcello turned then, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Talking gets people killed, Sophia. The legal protection you were so quick to brag about is built on the fact that no one, not even the magistrates your mother dines with, dares to say the names out loud. You didn't just remind me who your mother was tonight. You reminded everyone in that room that there is a paper trail. You made us a target." "Good," she snapped. "Maybe if the target is big enough, the whole system will finally collapse, including the parts of it that think they own me." Marcello reached out, his hand moving so fast she didn't have time to flinch. He didn't grab her. He tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the cold gold chain at her neck. The touch was unexpectedly gentle, contrasting sharply with the harshness of his words. "You think you're a rebel," he murmured. "But you're just a girl who hasn't seen the dark long enough to fear it. You want to know about the professional boundaries? You want to know why your mother and I have spent 20 years in this dance." He shifted in his seat, unbuttoning his charcoal suit jacket. He pulled back the fine silk of his shirt at the shoulder, revealing a jagged, puckered scar that disappeared beneath his collarbone. "I took a bullet for your mother 10 years ago. Not because I loved her and not because of a contract. I took it because she was the only person in this country who knew how to turn a street war into a board meeting. We aren't partners, Sophia. We are survivors of the same wreckage." Sophia stared at the scar, the reality of his world crashing into her academic understanding of it. This wasn't a case study. This was blood and bone. "She never told me," Sophia whispered. "She wouldn't. Luciana doesn't deal in debts. She deals in leverage. To tell you that I saved her life would be to admit she was ever vulnerable. And your mother would rather die than be seen as weak." Marcello leaned closer, his scent, expensive tobacco and something more metallic, filling the small space of the car. "I've spent half my life making sure no one sees that vulnerability. And then you walk in, wearing a dress that screams for attention and a tongue that cuts deeper than a blade, and you expose everything." "I didn't mean to." "You didn't think," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "You wanted to hurt her, so you swung at the nearest thing. But in this world, Sophia, when you swing at your mother, you hit me. And when you hit me, the city bleeds." The intensity in his gaze was suffocating. Sophia felt the power dynamic shift again. She had thought her mother was the master and Marcello the servant, but looking at him now, she saw the truth. He was the foundation. Without his violence, her mother's law was just ink on paper. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why not just let me believe the lie?" Marcello's hand moved from her neck to her jaw, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that made her toes curl in her silk heels. "Because I'm tired of the lie too," he admitted, his eyes dropping to her mouth. "I've spent 20 years being the shadow. But shadows don't get to touch the light. And tonight, Sophia, you were glowing." The air in the car turned electric. The defiance that had fueled Sophia all night morphed into something else, a hunger she didn't recognize, a need to be seen by the only man who seemed to actually look at her. "You're my mother's friend," she whispered, echoing the very warning she was about to ignore. "We shouldn't do this." Marcello's thumb pressed harder against her lip, pulling it down slightly. "I'm not her friend, Sophia. I'm her shadow. And shadows belong to the night." He leaned in, and for a heartbeat, Sophia thought he would kiss her. She wanted him to. She wanted to feel the rough edge of his world against the polished surface of hers. But at the last second, Marcello pulled back, his jaw tight. He restarted the engine, the roar of the Maserati breaking the spell. "I'm taking you home," he said, his voice back to its professional icy mask. "Tomorrow, you're going to stay in the villa. No gala. No office. You've done enough damage for 1 week." Sophia sat back, her skin still humming where he had touched her. He was trying to push her away, to re-establish the babysitter role, but it was too late. She had seen the scar. She had felt the heat. "You can lock the doors, Marcello," she said, her voice regaining its edge as they sped past the Duomo. "But you can't stop me from looking at the files. If you're the foundation, I'm going to find out exactly where the cracks are." Marcello didn't reply, but his grip on the wheel told her everything she needed to know. The hunt had changed. She wasn't the prey anymore. She was the investigator, and Marcello Vitti was the most dangerous piece of evidence she had ever encountered. If you were Sophia, would you trust the man with the scar or the mother with the law? Tell us why in the comments. The villa was silent, but for Sophia the silence was no longer peaceful. It was a challenge. Marcello had ordered her to stay within the confines of the estate, thinking that the locked gates and the guards at the perimeter would keep her idle. He didn't understand that Sophia Conti didn't need a car to escape. She only needed a key. She knew where her mother kept the old ledger. It wasn't a physical book. Luciana was too smart for that. But a series of encrypted drives kept in a safe behind a portrait of the Madonna in the study. Sophia had watched her mother enter the code 100 times during her teenage years, back when she was just a curious girl and not a threat. The study smelled of aged paper and her mother's sharp, citrus perfume. Sophia worked quickly, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When the safe clicked open, she didn't find stacks of cash or passports. She found a single, sleek silver drive labeled Vitti/Conti 2005 to 2025. She retreated to her bedroom, barricading the door and opening her laptop. The screen flickered to life, and as she bypassed the initial security layers, the professional boundaries Marcello spoke of began to dissolve into cold hard data. It was a map of a shadow empire. Every legal victory her mother had won over the last 2 decades was cross-referenced with a service provided by the Vitti organization. A dismissed racketeering charge in 2012 coincided with the sudden, quiet retirement of a key witness who had moved to South America with a suspiciously large pension. A zoning law that favored Vitti real estate was passed 3 days after a private donation was made to a local official's offshore account. But it was the more recent files that made Sophia's blood run cold. They weren't just business transactions. They were personal. There were photos of Marcello and Luciana from 10 years ago, taken in a hospital room. Marcello looked ghastly, his chest bandaged, his eyes glazed with pain. Luciana was sitting by his bed, her hand resting on his. The notes attached to the file described an incident in Palermo, an assassination attempt meant for her mother that Marcello had intercepted. The debt wasn't just professional. It was the foundation of their entire alliance. Marcello wasn't her mother's subordinate. He was her protector, and she was his architect. Together, they had built a version of Milan where the law was merely the skin that covered the muscle of the Mafia. Sophia scrolled further, her eyes stinging from the blue light. She found a subfolder titled Sophia. Inside were reports from her time in London. Every grade she received, every friend she made, and even her medical records from a brief bout of pneumonia in her second year. She had thought she was free in London, but Marcello's shadows had been there too, reporting back to her mother. And then she saw the most recent entry, dated just 2 days ago. Subject: Sophia Conti. Risk assessment: high. Strategic recommendation: proximity to VD remains the most effective containment. If the subject attempts to leverage legal knowledge, initiate Protocol 4. Protocol 4, Sophia whispered, her fingers trembling on the trackpad. She searched the drive for the term. It wasn't a legal strategy. It was a liquidation plan for the VD Conti partnership, a burn-it-all-down scenario where Marcello's organization would take the fall to keep the Conti firm's reputation pristine. Her mother was prepared to sacrifice Marcello to save herself. And Marcello, the man who had taken a bullet for her, likely didn't even know. A heavy knock at her door made her jump, nearly knocking the laptop off her lap. Sophia. Open the door. It was Marcello. His voice was tired, stripped of the bravado he used in public. She scrambled to hide the drive, shoving the laptop under her duvet. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. I'm tired, Marcello. Go away. I know you're not sleeping. I can see the light under the door, he said. There was a pause, then the sound of a key turning in the lock. Sophia had forgotten. He was the one who owned the keys. The door swung open. Marcello stood there, his tie loosened, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked at her, his eyes immediately zeroing in on the suspicious lump under her blankets. He didn't move toward her. He stayed in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim hall light. You were always a bad liar, even when you were a child, he said softly. And you were always a better spy than a friend, Sophia shot back, her defensive walls slamming up. I know about London, Marcello. I know you had people watching me. Marcello sighed, leaning his head against the doorframe. I didn't have people watching you to report back to your mother. I had them there to make sure no one else did. You're a Conti. You don't realize how many enemies that name carries. Stop pretending this is about my safety, Sophia said, standing up and pulling the laptop out. I found the drive. I found the incident in Palermo. I know you saved her life, and I know she has a plan to destroy yours the second you become a liability. Marcello's expression didn't change. He didn't look surprised or angry. He looked weary. I've known about Protocol 4 for 5 years, Sophia. The confession drained the air from the room. Sophia stared at him, bewildered. You knew. You knew she was planning to throw you to the wolves, and you still stayed? You still protect her. Marcello took a step into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. He walked to the edge of her bed, his gaze fixing on hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. I don't stay for her anymore, he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. Then why? He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face before he finally let his fingers brush her cheek. Because the only thing keeping that protocol from being activated is me. As long as I am useful, you are safe. As long as I am the shadow, you get to live in the light. I don't want to live in a light provided by your misery. Sophia cried, her heart breaking for the man she was supposed to hate. Then help me, Marcello whispered, his face moving closer to hers. Help me rewrite the ending. In that moment, the paper trail didn't matter. The laws didn't matter. There was only the heat between them and the terrifying realization that Sophia wasn't just her mother's daughter. She was the only person who could save the monster she had fallen for. Is Sophia being too reckless with her mother's secrets? Let us know in the comments. Hashtag Team Sophia or hashtag Team Marcello. The air in the bedroom grew thick, the weight of Marcello's hand on Sophia's cheek grounding her even as her world spun. He wasn't just a guardian or a criminal anymore. He was a man who had intentionally stepped into a trap to keep her from being the bait. But Sophia was a Conti, and she had spent her life learning that the only way to beat a trap was to dismantle the person who set it. Rewrite the ending? Sophia whispered, her eyes searching his. Marcello, you're talking about a war. If we go against my mother, she won't just take your business. She'll use every legal connection she has to make sure you never see the sun again. And she'll disown me before the ink is dry on the warrants. She already disowned the version of you she couldn't control, Marcello said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The moment you walked into that gala in that dress, you became a variable she couldn't account for. That's why she wants to activate Protocol 4. She sees us, together, and it terrifies her. Because I have the muscle and you have the mind to make it legitimate. Before Sophia could respond, the heavy oak door of her bedroom didn't just open. It was thrown back against the wall with a violence that made the crystal lamps on her vanity rattle. Luciana stood in the hallway, her face a mask of cold aristocratic fury. She was still in her suit from the day's meetings, her pearls gleaming like shark's teeth in the dim light. I expected rebellion from you, Sophia, Luciana said, her voice a low, lethal hiss. I expected you to flirt with the edges of the world I built for you. But to invite the help into your bed? To dig through files that are meant to protect your very existence? Marcello stood up slowly, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that placed him squarely between Sophia and her mother. He didn't reach for a weapon, but the way he settled his weight told Sophia he was ready for one. She isn't digging for fun, Luciana. She's digging because she realized the protection you've been selling her is a lie. Get out, Marcello, Luciana commanded, stepping into the room. The boundaries were clear. You were to watch her, not corrupt her. I should have known your loyalty was as shallow as your pedigree. My loyalty has a price tag of a bullet in my lung, Luciana. Don't talk to me about pedigree, Marcello roared, his voice shaking the walls. It was the first time Sophia had seen him truly lose his composure, the polished boss replaced by the scarred survivor. I've kept your hands clean for 20 years while you looked down your nose at me. But you will not use Sophia as a chess piece to cover your tracks. Luciana turned her gaze to Sophia, ignoring Marcello as if he were already a ghost. You think you've found a hero? Look at him, Sophia. He is a predator. He is the reason your father's name is whispered in fear rather than respect. He thinks he's saving you, but he's just looking for a new master, one who's young enough to be fooled. He didn't fool me, Mother, Sophia said, standing up and stepping out from behind Marcello. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to stand tall, the silver drive clutched in her hand. I saw the reports. I saw Protocol 4. You aren't protecting me. You're protecting the firm. You were going to let Marcello take the fall for the VD accounts just so you could keep your seat on the Judicial Council. Luciana's eyes flickered to the drive, a momentary lapse in her armor. The firm is the legacy, Sophia. Without it, you are nothing but the daughter of a criminal associate. I am doing what is necessary. No, Sophia said, her voice gaining a sharp clinical edge. You're doing what's easy. But I've been reading your shadow files for 4 hours. I didn't just find out about Marcello. I found the offshore accounts you opened in my name without my consent. The ones you used to funnel the consulting fees from the VD organization. If Marcello goes down for racketeering, I go down for money laundering. You didn't protect me, Mother. You turned me into your insurance policy. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcello turned to look at Sophia, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and dawning realization. Even he hadn't known how deep Luciana's machinations went. Luciana didn't flinch. She simply crossed her arms. And what do you think you can do with that information? You're a student. I am the law. I'm a Conti, Sophia countered, stepping forward until she was inches from her mother. And according to your own files, I am the majority shareholder of the subsidiary that holds those accounts. I don't need to be the law to fire my own legal counsel. As of right now, I'm moving my business to a firm in London. And Marcello, he isn't your help anymore. You're making a mistake that will destroy us all, Luciana whispered, the first hint of fear touching her voice. No, Sophia said, turning to Marcello and reaching for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong and steady. I'm just reminding you who my mother should have been. Someone who protects her family, not her assets. Marcello looked down at Sophia, a dark, fierce pride burning in his eyes. He looked back at Luciana, his voice cold and final. The professional boundaries are gone, Luciana. From now on, you talk to Sophia. And if you want to activate any protocols, you'll have to go through me. And we both know you don't have enough men for that. He led Sophia out of the room, leaving Luciana standing in the wreckage of her own study. As they walked toward the car, the cool night air felt like a victory. But as they drove away from the villa, Marcello gripped her hand tight. You realize what we just did? He asked, his voice low. We started a revolution, Sophia replied. No, Marcello said, a grim smile touching his lips. We started a war. And tomorrow we have to make sure we're the ones left standing. Was Sophia right to stand up to her mother, or has she just put herself in even more danger? Let us know. #Sophia the Rebel or #Luciana the Queen. The air in Milan felt different the next morning. Sharper, as if the city itself knew that the pillars of the Contividi alliance had begun to crumble. Sophia and Marcello had spent the night in a high-security penthouse he owned near the Navigli, a glass-and-steel fortress that felt far more honest than the marble villa. Now, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Sophia stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the emerald silk dress once more. It was the same dress Marcello had bought her to look the part, but tonight it wasn't a gift or a bribe. It was a uniform. You're sure about this? Marcello asked, appearing in the reflection behind her. He was dressed in a black suit, his expression a grim mask of focus. Your mother has called a reconciliation dinner at the Villa Santoro. She's invited the top brass of the Judicial Council. It's not a dinner, Sophia. It's a trial. I know, Sophia said, turning to face him. She thinks that by putting me in a room full of her equals, she can shame me back into being her daughter. She wants me to see the power I'm walking away from. But I'm not walking away from power, Marcello. I'm taking it with me. She held up the silver drive, then tucked it securely into the small silk clutch that matched her dress. The emerald trap isn't for me. It's for her. The drive back to the Villa Santoro was tense. Marcello's men followed in 2 black SUVs, a visible sign that the professional boundaries had been replaced by a war footing. When they arrived, the villa was ablaze with light. Luciana had spared no expense. Vintage Barolo, white truffles from Alba, and a table set for 12 of the most powerful people in Italy. Luciana sat at the head of the table, looking like a Borgia queen in a gown of stiff navy brocade. To her left was Justice Moretti. To her right, the chief of police. They all looked up as Sophia and Marcello entered. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. Ah, the prodigal daughter returns, Luciana said, her voice smooth and devoid of the fury from the night before. And she's brought her shadow. Sit, please. We were just discussing the future of the city's redevelopment projects. Sophia sat directly opposite her mother. Marcello remained standing behind her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, a silent, immovable presence. We aren't here for redevelopment, Mother, Sophia said. her voice ringing out clearly over the clinking of silverware. "We're here because you've spent 20 years using the men at this table to build a facade of legality for Marcello's business, and now that the facade is cracking, you're looking for someone to blame." Justice Moretti cleared his throat, his face reddening. "Sophia, this is hardly the time for—" "It's the only time," Sophia interrupted. She opened her clutch and placed the silver drive on the white tablecloth. It looked like a small, lethal insect against the fine lace. "On this drive is a detailed map of every consulting fee paid to the members of this council over the last decade. It also contains the original draft of Protocol 4, the plan to liquidate the Viti organization and use Marcello Viti as a scapegoat for the very crimes this table authorized." The room went deathly still. The chief of police looked at Luciana, his eyes wide with betrayal. Luciana, however, simply took a slow sip of her wine. "You think you can threaten us?" Luciana asked. "If that drive goes to the press, you go to prison with us, Sophia. I made sure your name was on those accounts for a reason." "I know," Sophia said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "But I'm a law student, Mother. I know that under Italian law, an accomplice who provides state's evidence against a criminal conspiracy is granted total immunity, especially if they were coerced into the role while still a dependent. I've already sent an encrypted copy of this drive to a firm in London. If I don't check in by midnight, it goes to the European Court of Human Rights." Marcello leaned down, his voice a low, terrifying growl that echoed in the silent room. "And if any of you think about touching her before that clock strikes 12, you'll find out exactly why my organization has survived for 30 years without a law degree." Luciana finally set her glass down, her hand trembling just enough to be noticed. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw someone she couldn't break. Sophia wasn't her mother's daughter. She was her mother's replacement. "What do you want?" Luciana whispered. "I want the Viti-Conti partnership dissolved," Sophia said. "I want Marcello's assets legalized through a legitimate blind trust that I will oversee. And I want you to retire, Mother. Move to the villa in Como. Stay out of the law and stay out of our lives." "And if I refuse?" Sophia stood up, the emerald silk shimmering like a serpent's skin. "Then we see who the Italian people hate more, a mafia boss who saved a life, or a lady of the law who sold her own daughter to keep a secret." She turned and walked out of the room, not looking back. Marcello followed her, his heavy footsteps a rhythmic promise of protection. As they reached the hallway, the sound of the dining room erupted into panicked shouting, but Sophia didn't stop. They reached the front doors, the cool night air hitting them like a benediction. Marcello grabbed her arm, spinning her around to face him. He looked stunned, his obsidian eyes searching hers with a mix of awe and terror. "You played them," he whispered. "You used the dress, the dinner, the law. You trapped them all." "I learned from the best," Sophia said, her voice finally shaking as the adrenaline began to ebb. "I reminded them who my mother was, Marcello. But I showed them who I am." Marcello didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into his arms, his kiss tasting of salt and victory. In the heart of Milan, surrounded by the ruins of an empire, they had found their own. Was Sophia's emerald trap the perfect revenge, or did she just start a war she can't finish? Let us know in the comments. Hashtag Queen Sophia or hashtag the fall of Conti. The transition was not a quiet one. In the weeks following the confrontation at Villa Santoro, the elite circles of Milan were rocked by the sudden, health-related retirement of Luciana Conti and several high-ranking members of the Judicial Council. The scandal was contained, smothered by the very legal expertise Sophia had used to ignite it, but the power vacuum was undeniable. The Iron Lady had retreated to the silent shores of Lake Como, leaving behind a legacy of marble and secrets. Sophia sat in her new office, located in a glass and steel high-rise that looked down on the old Conti firm. It was smaller, leaner, and entirely hers. She was no longer a student. She was the managing partner of a firm that specialized in transitional legality. A knock at the door signaled a familiar presence. Marcello entered, looking younger than he had in years. The weight of being a shadow had lifted, replaced by the solid confidence of a man whose life was finally his own. He no longer wore the charcoal suits of a Mafia lieutenant. He wore navy blue, looking every bit the legitimate industrialist he was becoming. "The blind trust is finalized," Marcello said, placing a folder on her desk. "All VD assets have been scrubbed. The shipping, the real estate, the construction. It's all under the new holding company. Clean. Legal. Untouchable." Sophia stood up, walking to the window. "It feels strange. For years, I thought the only way to be free was to run away to London or Boston. I didn't realize I just had to take the keys." Marcello walked up behind her, his warmth a familiar comfort against her back. He didn't wrap his arms around her. He stood as her equal, his gaze fixed on the same horizon. "You didn't just take the keys, Sophia. You changed the locks. Your mother didn't think you had the stomach for the blood, and I didn't think you had the stomach for the dirt. We were both wrong." "I still have the stomach for neither," Sophia said, turning to look at him. "But I have the stomach for the truth. We're not saints, Marcello. We've just decided to stop pretending that the law and the underworld are two different worlds. They're just two different ways of managing the same human desires." Marcello reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. The scar on his shoulder was hidden beneath his fine suit, but the memory of it remained, a reminder of the price of loyalty. "I have 50 years of experience in the old world, Sophia. I've seen empires rise and fall based on fear. But I've never seen one built on whatever this is between us." "It's not fear," Sophia whispered, leaning into his touch. "It's leverage. And I think I'm the only one who knows how to use yours." 2 years later, the impossible alliance was the talk of Italy. Sophia Conti and Marcello Viti were the new power couple of Milan, a fusion of legal brilliance and iron-willed authority. They had navigated the whispers, the social taboos, and the residual threats from her mother's old allies. They had built a life that was neither entirely in the light nor entirely in the dark, but in the vibrant, golden twilight of their own making. In a quiet garden overlooking the city, away from the flashbulbs in the courtrooms, Marcello sat on a stone bench, watching Sophia. She was holding a leather-bound book, not a law text, but a journal of their own history. "You're my mother's friend," she said suddenly, her eyes twinkling with the ghost of their first real confrontation. "We really shouldn't have done this." Marcello laughed, a deep, rich sound that echoed through the trees. He stood up, walking toward her and pulling her into a kiss that tasted of freedom and a future they had fought to earn. "Are you sure?" he murmured against her lips. "Because I think the last 2 years have been the most successful consultation of my career." Sophia smiled, closing her eyes as the sun set over Milan, painting the sky in shades of emerald and gold. Their story had begun with a threat and ended with an empire. And as the city lights began to twinkle below, it was clear that the new reign was only just beginning.